Steve Howe. I'm on the faculty in the psychology department, and UC Leaf is sponsoring this talk. Leaf is Leadership, Empowerment, and Advancement for Women STEM Scientists. Valerie Hardcastle is the executive director. Karen Fauborg is on the staff. Rachel Kalin, raise your hand. Where's Rachel? They're all back up in the back. You can go to the UC Leaf website and find out much more about Leaf. We're really terribly excited to have with us today Dr. Diane Halpern.
That would be me.
Claremont McKenna College, and from an exciting new educational venture called the NERVA, which I'm not going to say anything about because it would take too long to explain. Diane took her PhD in experimental psychology here at the University of Cincinnati a long time ago, along with me, and she then went on to become president of the American Psychological Association. She holds an endowed chair at Claremont McKenna. Her work is considered groundbreaking in the area of critical thinking, gender differences in cognition, and on work-family integration. She's a prolific author. When the controversial book, The Bell Curve by Herrnstein and Murray was published in 1994, Diane was one of the 11 people appointed by the American Psychological Association's Office of Scientific Affairs to study the book and to write, not exactly a rebuttal, but a critical review. That was published in 1996, 1997. Diane was one of the 11 authors of that, Intelligence Knowns and Unknowns. It's been cited 1,000 times. And so we are just delighted to have her with us here. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Diane Halpern.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve, for the warm introduction. I apologize for the late start. It happens, what can we say? Delighted to be back home, and really want to thank everyone for showing up. And for those of you who are undergraduates or graduates, I want to tell you how dear UC is to me. I am very, very grateful to our wonderful faculty, our wonderful colleagues and students at the time, and I really feel that it prepared me well for the rest of my life. Still in, and just a funny story, when I was here, Steve was my statistics TA. So there must be some moral here. You don't know where you're going to run into these people again later in life. Although when he did call, I did have this pang about my homework being late. Although he assures me that wasn't the reason. I have finished the 4th edition of my textbook, Sex Differences in Cognitive Abilities. And it's a topic that's now I've written about over 25 years. So I'm going to talk some about what stayed the same and what has changed over these 25 years, with some particular emphasis on STEM and STEM disciplines and the implications for it. So let's think about, first, why should we even care about this topic? Why is this convince you that it's worth knowing about? And there are lots and lots of reasons. You know, channel surf, lurk on somebody's blog site, you know, peruse the literature, read fiction, listen in on conversations on the bus or in your home table. And without very long time, very soon, you're going to find something turns to a question about how women and men are different, and different in their cognition. Some of it's outrageous, some of it's more serious, but it certainly is a topic of widespread interest. As a country, we have a dwindling supply of advanced mathematicians and scientists, tremendous critical need for the future of the country, and yet we have underrepresentation of women in these fields. About almost half of the U.S. workforce is female and male, yet the differences in the STEM workforce, women are seriously underrepresented. So why is that? What is it? And this is a multifaceted question. Why is it? Is it something in the cognitive abilities of women and men? Is there something? I thought I was loud enough.
Not for the videotape.
Okay, I'm loud enough for everybody else. Is it on? Thank you. Okay. When I used to teach in those large lecture halls, and when I first started here, I would be so loud, the people in the back of the room would ask me to lower my voice. So I don't usually need a mic, unless, of course, we're taping. So there are really central questions. Why are, in fact, most careers, most aspects, most spheres of life gender segregated? That is, majority of women, majority of men in many things in our life. What is it about cognitive abilities is obviously only going to be part of an answer, but how does that explain any of it? The kinds of answers that we come up with have public policy implications. I've been an expert witness on a number of cases, really court cases, affirmative action, single-sex schools, child-rearing practices, and so on. So there have been really a lot of reasons why I think you should study it. In thinking about these questions, usually what happens is first, people will say, the usual response is, well, you know, there really are no differences. So I will present some data today that say, in fact, here's, you know, data that show that there are. And then the next response will be, well, if they are, they're small. And I'm going to say that some are small, some are non-existent, but some are large. And then, well, if some are large, then certainly they're due to social and environmental socialization practices. Undoubtedly, that is true. Nobody is going to disagree with that, but I'm going to show some data, depending how much time we have, that says the contribution of biology is not zero. Now, that's a long way to go, but it's often a topic that people find very difficult and very uncomfortable to talk about. Some things have stayed the same over these 25 years. We call it was 25 years ago when I was quoting someone who said it was an international obsession. And indeed, it is. If you look up the research literature, the number of hits that come up are hundreds of thousands. It's across a whole range of areas. It is a topic that is probably as old as humankind and also as new as this morning's news. So it is an area where there is a great deal of interest. It isn't just hot in the sense that it's fashionable. It's hot in the sense that it's inflammatory. People have very, very strong beliefs, and in fact, it often generates more non-constructive kind of argument than the kind that is constructive and based on evidence. We don't like to talk about differences. Talk about differences seem un-American, undemocratic, but ignoring the data, the only alternative to not address it is to, in fact, ignore it. And ignoring data, ignoring what we see in the, how we interpret it, those are all other issues. But pretending they're not there does not advance a field, does not reduce stereotyping, does not do anything except, does not allow us to ever address anything in a reasoned way. We don't like biological explanations, and I'm going to talk some about biology. And something else I learned in these decades of studying it, every time I talk about it, it almost becomes a laboratory experiment in what's known as confirmation bias. We have a very strong bias for things that, that fit with our worldview. You each have certain beliefs about the world, and if I give you data that confirms those beliefs, you're willing to nod and say, yup, right on. And if I give you data or talk about research that runs counter to it, you're likely to say, well, wait, I questioned those data. What was that design? That can't possibly be right. They didn't control for something else. And in fact, the biases are very, very strong, and I think it's important that we be open-minded. After I write, at the end of my book of many hundred pages, I really ask readers to say, have you changed your views on anything? If not, why not? Because there's lots of data of all sorts, and in fact, it should make you change your view. Something else that has stayed the same is really two fundamental questions to consider. One is, what does it mean to say there are differences? And I'm going to talk about on average differences. And I'm going to use the term on average every few minutes. because I'm going to remind you, of course, that we're talking about group level differences, and there are, of course, variability in groups, so that people themselves may not fit any of these responses, but I'm talking about what is on average true about women, about men at different parts in life. Saying that there's differences does not mean that there's deficiencies. I'm going to talk about some areas where on average women excel, some where on average men excel, and some that show no differences. If we want to bring this back to questions of STEM, in STEM we need all kinds of cognitive abilities. We need good verbal skills, we need good math skills, we need good visual spatial skills. So the fact that there are on average differences does not mean that any one of these particular areas is better suited for one gender or one sex or the other. And why are we so afraid of it? We hate to talk about differences. People will sometimes say to me, why do you talk about differences? You should talk about similarities. Well, it's not possible to talk about similarities without talking about differences, or differences without talking about similarities. We find the differences more interesting in many ways. Our statistical procedures are designed to pick them up, but we are afraid of them for good reason. I think we should be very careful in how we talk about them and think about differences. Differences among different groups of people have always been used as a way to actually say my group is better than your group, whatever your group is, and I've been used throughout history to oppress various groups, and most typically in misogynist kinds of agendas. This is a quote from the National Institute of Drug Abuse. Conducting a sex/gender analysis of data is a matter of doing good science. If you are doing drug abuse research and you are not looking at whether you're talking about women or men, you are not doing good research. Both abuse drugs, but there are different kinds that are on average abused, different patterns of development, and if you really want to understand it, if you want to be able to intervene, if you want to be able to do something, you need to break it down to a level, and I think that that is a predominant factor in how we view the world. The question is not, are women and men similar or different? Because they are both similar and different. These images were just pulled off of a Common Kids website. There were ones that were even more extreme, but certainly makes you think about how we communicate about being female and being male. A judge, I've done a lot of expert testimony, and a judge said to me, so are you telling me, Dr. Halpern, that women and men are the same? I said, well, no, not if we're talking about their respective roles in reproduction. That would be a pretty silly kind of thing. But we're talking here about cognition, and we're talking about where they are similar and where they are different with regards to different abilities. So we are similar and we are different. The questions are, when are we similar? When do we see differences? How do we understand both? When do they emerge? What does this say? What kinds of messages are they sending? The difference between male and female is something that everybody knows and nobody knows. Now, those of you who know John Money, some of you are cringing that I'm actually citing him. However, let me say that I think that this is a very wise statement, because when I teach about this topic, everyone has strong opinions. Everyone is either female or male. Yes, and a few are intersex, but in fact, they have strong opinions too. And in fact, I keep thinking, geez, if I only taught something like particle physics or something like black holes, people would just maybe write it down, ask, and not argue, you got that all wrong. And I think that this is the kind of area that we all have personal kinds of expertise. And you know, where do these ideas come from? We know that it starts very early. Talking about kids talking about the differences between girls and boys at a very young age, and from a very young age, they in fact have very strong beliefs about the differences between girls and boys. So it happens at a very young age. Well, these are some things that have stayed the same. What's changed over all these years? Well, one of the big changes is that we have a biological revolution in our understanding of brain behavior relationships. Modern neuroscience has permeated every area of psychology. And, it is really changing how we think about these things. But the change has not always been for the better. Modern neuroscience has been and continues to be misused to justify sometimes the status quo and in support of saying, look, our stereotypes about the beliefs about women and men are embedded in the brain. They're embedded in their neuroscience. And several writers have used the term neurosexism. That is to argue on the basis of neuroscience about the idea being that it's innate differences in women and men. But the brain, in fact, is a very malleable kind of organ. Experience is a major architect of the brain. So we know that the experiences that we have in life dramatically alter our brain. Paradoxically, one of the things that modern neuroscience has done is that in some way it has highlighted and helped us to understand the importance of socialization and environmental variables. So in fact, we know how certain kinds of experiences cause differences in the structure, organization, density of different parts of the brain, so that we now actually have a much better understanding and a mechanism of how the external world, it gets inside our brain than we ever had. So in some sense, paradoxically, it has made environmental and social variables even more important. Let me give you an example of what I mean by the misuse of data. This is a quote from some authors. Girls have, in general, strong neural connections in their temporal lobes. These connectors lead to more centrally detailed memory storage, better listening, better discrimination among tones of voice, and this leads, among other things, to greater use of detail in writing assignments. So what you have here is someone arguing that it is in the brain, and it is because of these neural mechanisms and the way women and men, girls and boys differ, that we have differences in details, memories, difference in writing skills. I know this is a little bit long, too many words for any slide, but I thought it was important because this was the response of a researcher who was a public policy piece, who shows how this is a classic example of misapplying brain research to education and to gender. The problem is they string together a bunch of things about the brain and a bunch of things about how girls and boys differ in their behavior and in their abilities, and attempt to say that it's causal. It may be so that boys use less detail in their writing, and it may be so that there are different patterns of neural connections in the brain, but there is no reason for making that leap that says that it is those brain structure differences that cause the greater detailed writing. And we see this time and time again, and the public is very, very much enamored with neuroscience data. So we have a lot of people now making brain-based kinds of statements as the cause of everyday behavioral differences that are absolutely unwarranted. And I think once you start looking for it, you'll be surprised at how many places it is. What else has changed? Well, a phenomenon research called stereotype threat has become a cottage industry. It is huge. There is so much research on it that you could do meta-analyses of the meta-analyses at this point. And the idea here is that if you are a member of some group that performs less well as a group on a particular type of test, so maybe it's women in math, for example, then in fact, this creates even if you don't believe it's true, even if you don't believe it applies to you, that this has an effect in high performance, high stakes testing environments that causes a depression in performance. It is a huge research literature, but certainly that is one thing that has changed. We've learned that our stereotypes are, I say, mostly accurate. And by that I mean, and this is some of my own research, if I handed out a questionnaire and I asked you, on average, I wouldn't ask it this way, but I would get at the idea, on average, women or men, who scores higher on the math SATs? Who, on average, women or men, who scores higher on memory skills? If I gave you a map, on average, what percent of men or women could use it to get to a complicated place? Most of you, in fact, know what the stereotype is. You may say that you yourself deny that it's truth to it, but you will likely say that other people believe it. But we certainly know what it is. If we look at the actual cognitive differences, in fact, they are mostly supportive of the stereotype. But this is still a pernicious area because there are huge individual differences. So even though I'm going to say that on average one group scores higher than another group on certain cognitive tests, it doesn't of course mean everyone in that group does. And we still, what happens then is we tend to discriminate against the individual based on group level data. What else that has changed is we have a much better appreciation for the effect of unconscious influences on our behaviors and our attitudes, certainly things like stereotype threat or things that we're not conscious of, the ways things in our environment change the way we act. And also in the earlier years, I used to bemoan the fact that we did not have very much international data. Now we have a huge amount of cross-cultural international data. For example, a BBC study has, 500,000 respondents from around the world. There's all kinds of such data sets now. So certainly one of the things that happens is we have a lot more on international and cross-cultural data. Many years ago, I wrote a journal article that said what you see depends on where you look. And people look for what they want to see. So I'm going to give you data that, in fact, you could almost spin in any direction. But what you take away from it will often depend on not taking the whole picture, but taking away with you what it is you wanted, what it is you expected to see. Whether, in fact, there are large or small or no differences, for example, on tests of math ability. I'm going to give you some data that might allow you to come to any of those conclusions. What you need to do instead is look at the totality of data and say, when do I get conclusions in one direction or the other direction? There is no smarter sex. By IQ tests are written deliberately to show no gender differences. So it isn't as though I could use one of our standardized IQ tests and say, aha, I found out who really is smarter, though I see some of you nudging each other and saying you really know. And in fact, there are some tests that show advantages for females, some that show advantages for males, and some that show no differences. But overall, we have no reason to believe that there is a smarter sex. Differences. Females tend to do better on assessments that are more closely tied to what's taught in school and the curriculum. In general, males tend to do better on tests that are more divorced from the curriculum, sometimes called drop-in from the sky tests. There's in a derogatory way. So we tend to get differences even on the same conception, same ability, that are going to vary. Differences are largest at the tails of the distribution, the highest achievers, the lowest achievers. The differences on all of these abilities are smaller in the middle of the distribution where most people fall. And there are different developmental trajectories. Differences wax and wane throughout the lifespan, and I'll show you some of those data. So, the size of the difference is going to be much more nuanced than simply some of the differences. Well, where do we get some differences? Where are some areas, for example, where women, on average, score much higher? And reading, and especially writing, is one of those areas where females, on average, do much better than males. How much better? The average writing ability of an 8th grade girl is equal to that of an 11th grade boy. Now, we very often don't have good cross-cultural tests of writing, but when you look at it, there's almost always an advantage when there is a writing component. So if I'm going to assess your knowledge and assess your ability, I'm going to have an advantage for females if in fact I have a written response as opposed to a multiple choice response, other things being equal. And I might note that the most recent, and in 2 years, the SATs are going to make the writing portion optional. Now, I remember when they put the writing portion in. And when they put the writing portion in, depending on who you listen to, certainly it was, I would guess, at least in part in response to the fact that on average girls were scoring lower on the SATs. So if I added a writing test, maybe I helped to balance it. So some people said, well, you're just tinkering with stuff to make girls look better. Others said, what do you mean tinkering? You're adding a very important component for success in college. So how is that tinkering? You're just assessing what you should be assessing. Certain memory tasks show a female advantage. Memory for faces, for example, is a very large effect. Another large effect is memory for object location. So there are certain memory, certain verbal fluency tasks, and on average, the advantage is for girls, and I'll show you some cross-cultural data and try to convince you that these are, in fact, large effect sizes. These are important. Oh, these are percentage in top performers. These are international data. You'll see for every one of the countries listed among the top performers, there is a greater percentage of females than there are males. These are from 15-year-olds, but I have all sorts of data that mirror this. So in the highest performing ends cross-culturally, we find the advantage for females. Some of you are saying, well, what about the country with the littlest advantage? In this case, it's Mexico. In general, countries that tend not to score high overall on an assessment show the smallest differences between females and males. It seems as though no one is able to really fully develop their potential. I'll come back to that point again in a few minutes. These are mean differences. These are effect size differences. So these are, again, international data. These are 4th graders. I could have picked 8th graders. I could have updated it. It doesn't much matter. The bars, don't look all that different. These are fairly stable across time, across place. And the advantage in every single country, whether it's, this is reading literacy, goes to girls. It goes to girls early on. These are 4th grade data. You find it by 1st grade. So these are early on data. These are, show real advantages. In general, girls, women, depending, when you make that switch, get higher grades in school. Not by a huge amount, but certainly about 1/4 of a point on a 4-point grade point average. One of the things you'll notice is grade inflation is real. Everyone is going up, and you'll also notice that consistently girls are scoring higher. Even in those areas where they don't score as well on standardized assessments, they still get higher grades in class. So on average, it's true at college, it's true in graduate school. Now there are fewer women in some of these advanced math courses, but regardless of the fact that they're in smaller numbers, the ones that are there, in fact, tend to get higher grades. Some people have suggested that's because grades reflect lots of things in addition to ability, showing up on time, being polite, turning in your homework, things that perhaps are more consistent with the female gender role. Certainly these are, lots of ways to be argued. These are the data. We can talk about interpreting them. Other areas, higher for men, at least some of the time. Most of the media attention is on quantitative skills, but if you're looking at quantitative or math skills, you find that the biggest differences are in the tails of the distribution. There are, in fact, more males at the low ability end of the intelligence distribution. That is undoubtedly tied to genetics. So there are certain genetics that in fact are tied to mental retardation, and there are more males that fall in those categories. Forgetting that and looking at the high end of the distribution, you find the biggest difference at the tails. But even so, girls are getting better in grades in the same courses. An exception being algebra. Algebra is an area of mathematics. All math is not the same. It doesn't call on the same cognitive abilities. Algebra shows a female advantage. I have suggested that perhaps it's more language-like in structure than it is, almost like sentence-like, rather than more visual spatial. We find the differences that the tails, and you might say, well, more girls take the SATs and other standardized tests than males do, so that you would expect would depress the mean score because you had more girls who were from the lower ability in that pool. But if you look at states where it is required of everyone for graduation, and we have such states, you also find the same advantage for males. So this is, pretty much consistent. It is consistent across time. I could continue the graph. I had the graph for years prior to this for decades. I have plenty of data, as you might guess, and it is pretty much looks like two parallel curves with very little wiggle in there. The top bar being the males, the bottom being the females, mean SAT math scores. Could be the ACT, it doesn't much matter. You get a similar pattern. This is a graph that I especially like to spend some time on because it shows how the same data can really be used in lots of ways to understand it. First I like this graph. The first author on this, it was one of my former students, so I say this with great pride. I love to, show my students' work. And these has to do with the extreme high ability right-hand tail of the distributions. And back in 1981, actually when I started working in this area, the ratio of males to females in the highest scoring ends of the tails in math was like 14-to-1. That's huge. What you see is that the ratios in the highest scale end of the distribution have declined, and now they're somewhere between 3 and 4-to-1. So 3 and 4-to-1 is still a lot, in terms of the highest scorers in math and in science. But it's nowhere near what it used to be. Those in STEM fields, those of you who are taking majors, going on and to become faculty, going on to be graduate students, come from this group. So what it means that we have actually a smaller pool of females that we're drawing from the highest achievers in math and in science. And this is what the data are. You might say, well, that decline shows that it's strictly, environmental. You could say that. You could say, well, look, it's plateaued since 1991, so it shows that, we pretty much have straightened out or are going to stay there. You could say that. You could ask, what's the trajectory? And no one can predict the future. I don't know. But, the same data there's a lot of stories. Data tell stories. There's a lot of stories that we can read into these data, but they tell us a lot about cognitive abilities, females and males, and about their participation in a lot of the STEM areas. Of course, not all of the STEM areas are as math intensive as others. Some, like biology, are less math intensive. And we find that when we look at the biggest disparities in women's representation, they tend to be least represented in those fields that are math intensive and visual spatial skill intensive. And that's true even for something like economics, which is not a STEM area, but highly math intensive. The very largest difference is between women and men has to do with visual spatial skills. Visual spatial is a term we use Information is visual. It's coming in over your eyes. It has a spatial array. It has a layout. It includes sensation and perception, manipulating information in memory that's visual, spatial. These are huge effect sizes. Here we go. These tasks, the actual size of the effect depends on exactly what the task is and how we measure it. Some of these effect sizes, like the one I'm going to show, in three-dimensional mental rotation. Imagine a complex figure being rotated in space. These effects are so large that for the test of statistical significance, you can use the binocular test. You teach that, don't you, Steve?
I call it interocular trauma.
You do. And it's the idea is with both eyes open, you look at the data and say, yup, it's there. These are huge effect sizes, and these have not varied over decades. Okay, here's an example of such a test. Figures A and figures B. Take A, and what you would do on A, the task is, if I rotate the second figure on A, in depth plane, in the surface plane, however I rotate it, can I make it line up to be identical with A? Similarly, for the one in B, can I rotate that second one in space? We usually take reaction time measures. How long does it take you to make a response? And we also look at accuracy measures. And these are very large effect sizes. And I don't think that if you were answering honestly, do you think women or men excel at this task, that you would say anything other than men? And in fact, they do. Men, in fact, do better on this task. When we talk about math, we have both minimizers and maximizers when you read the literature. Now, if you are a minimizer and your message is that we're more similar than we're different, then you're going to focus on the middle part of the distribution, because on average, the average differences are much smaller. If you are a maximizer, you'll focus on the tail of the distribution where the differences are much larger. So both, in fact, are true. What do you care about? If you care about extraordinary talent in math, then you're going to be a person who focuses on the tail. If you care about average performance, the differences, in fact, are much, much smaller. Spatial skills are important in some kinds of math, but not all kinds of math. We tend to get a difference in those areas in math that are highly visual spatial. Maybe I shouldn't have thrown this in, but there is indeed a literature on sexual orientation and cognitive abilities. And it's a fairly sizable literature at this point. And it in fact says that heterosexual men outperform gay men on average on visual spatial tasks. And that has also a fairly large effect size. I'll show you another kind of task that shows very large distributions. We know that the tails, the ratio over time, has been decreasing in math and science. We don't have those kinds of data for visual spatial skills. These differences are found cross-culturally, and they're found throughout the lifespan. When we find them in non-human mammals, and indeed there are people who study visual spatial skills in rats. And you know, whenever we find them, they also tend to show that on average, the male rats are better than the female rats. And there are people that do other kinds of cross-species studies, and it's its own literature, but indeed we find it across species, across time, and across countries, and across age. But the important part is we can all get better with training. You can improve in these skills. There is three-dimensional, two-dimensional visual spatial training that has been shown in schools of engineering, for example, to help with the retention, mostly of women, but of men also who are likely to drop out of schools of engineering. So there is a whole research literature showing that we can get better on these skills with training. These are all educable. Just like you can read better, just like you can do math better. There's nothing here that says you can't get better at these skills. So, you know, that's why we have education. This is another test that shows large differences. This is a judgment of line and angle orientation. So for example, you might just see that little line segment way over there on the right, and then you have to use the numbers 1 to 13 and say which line is at that same orientation or slope. You see it here, the line is longer, it's easier, and he's on the right, on this side, you see here's the answer. That's the same orientation as 9. That's the same orientation as 12. These are very, very large effect sizes, and again, cross-nationally. People have, in fact, given that we have better object location memory, a kind of visual spatial task that favors females, and better kind of orientation kinds of rotation that favors male. People have said that there is this distinction in the brain between what's sometimes called the what is it and the where is it pathways. There's a lot of research going on currently looking at this as perhaps a locus, but we don't have any of those data. But this is certainly an area of active reference. They happen very early in life. In the earlier editions of my book, I said we get some of these differences in sex differences in visual spatial skills as early as kindergarten, which is as young as it could be measured. So every time I write a book, I have to go back and say, well, if you read the last difference, I said X and now I say Y. How early? 3 months, 2 months. Now, if someone had said to me, let's study this in 2 or 3 months old, I would have said, you're nuts. Don't bother. It's not going to work. And I would have been wrong. It has been now replicated with different paradigms across different laboratories. You might wonder, how do you study this in 3-month-olds? But we have techniques for studying cognition in infants. Essentially, it involves how long they look at stimuli, whether they know it's novel or not. But it's been found across laboratories with different kinds of stimuli as early as 3 months old. So it is younger than anything I would have believed to be true. These are the ones throughout the lifespan. What you have, these are cross age and across different topics. So up here we have mental rotation across the lifespan, where men are doing better. Over here, this is line orientation across the lifespan. This is a kind of fluency task, a verbal task. On average, across the lifespan, women are doing better. And you'll notice they don't show the decline that very much into old age. That has me feeling good. And down here, object location memory tasks. And again, you don't see that same decline. So there are certainly differences across the lifespan. They hold up across age groups, and they are sizable. Well, what about gender equity? People have looked cross-culturally and said, well, if a culture is more equitable, then do we have smaller effects on some of these variables? And there are ways that people measure gender equity in a culture, in a society. There's UN indices, there's economic indices, and this is a lot of studies. And the answer is, well, not what you would have expected. It seems that, I'll start in the middle, in gender-equal societies, girls perform as well as boys in math. So you tend to lose that difference in math. But you find larger differences favoring females in reading when it's more gender equitable, and larger differences favoring males in visual spatial, where it's more gender equitable. So you might be thinking, is this something screwy in the cognitive data? But in fact, we find that there are personality variables that are also tend to grow larger in more gender equitable societies. So, you know, these are certainly some puzzling, contradictory, surprising effects. Certainly not what anyone would have predicted, not what I would have predicted. So it doesn't seem that some of the biggest effects get larger when there's gender equity, perhaps because people can just develop better. Some of you are thinking, well, are there evolutionary explanations? And certainly the idea that there is an adaptive value to these differences that we see, and we can link it to the evolution of species. People who take an evolutionary stance will talk a lot about the effects of prenatal hormones, particularly androgens that are early in life. I will tell you now very briefly that yes, there are effects of prenatal androgens on the development of cognitive abilities. We see this in a variety of studies. How big the effects are, it's difficult to do research in this area, but it's certainly there. Others have said, well, the male brain has evolved to be better in this three-dimensional navigation because most of humanity have been hunter-gatherers and men were the hunters and they had to travel long distances to find the food. And because of differences in mating strategies. I have been very critical of this in a paper that we wrote, a very large paper by people with different orientations. We really had to write, we came to the evolutionary part, where the evolutionary psychologist said that these differences reflect evolutionary pressures, and I had to say, and others disagreed. We could not come together on the basis of what it means. I have argued that women also traveled long distances. These were gatherers, so they were not farmers, and they had to travel long distances with different seasons to find the crops that were available. And someone said to me, you know, Diane, plants don't move. And I said, I knew that, I really did. But in fact, people were constantly moving for warfare, constantly moving to follow crops. So there were a number of visual spatial skills that were important in early societies. There's also differences, there's small differences detected in the laboratory. You won't detect them in everyday tasks. That look at differences that vary over the menstrual cycle in cycling women. Be very difficult to understand how this has an evolutionary kind of explanation. This is mental rotation studies internationally. This is across a lot of countries, as you can see. The top line being males, the bottom line being females. And again, some of you are thinking, well, what's that country over there that has the least difference? It's that gender equitable country, Pakistan. And, you know, when I say things are never the way you expect it, I think that that's an example of what I meant by countries where are generally low scoring, where people are not scoring well. You don't get those differences because no one is developing their abilities. You get smaller differences, for example, in poverty. And poverty is bad for everyone's cognitive development. No one develops their abilities well in poverty. So you get fewer group differences because you have a floor effect, essentially, low data. I think this captures some of our thinking about this. You have someone there who's selling pencils, and he's saying, buy from me, it's not my fault. I'm unemployed, but it's 30% heredity, 70% environment. And those of you who remember West Side Story and the song Dear Officer Krupke, where he says, you know, it's not my fault that I'm a delinquent, I had a bad home life, I had a bad environment. I think this says a lot about our thinking. It says that we prefer environmental explanations, but he is no more responsible for his biology than he is for his environment. So you should be equally likely to buy pencils from him, regardless of the nature of explanations. It also says that we can separate the contribution of biology and environment, and they are not separable. They are like conjoined twins that share a common brain or a common heart. You can't pull them apart. Things that we consider, for example, to be biological, things like brain structures. Well, your brain is changed by your environment. Hormone levels. Your hormone levels change depending on your environment. So there are so many things that we cannot pull them apart. I prefer, instead of an either-or, tug-of-war, let's give one number summary for what percent is environment and what percent is biology, to really consider it as continuous feedback loops. that have both genetic and cultural kinds of origins, and how those of you who are good at something, let's say you're good at reading, you get more books as gifts, then you read better, and so on. So, and we also select our environments. We're not passive. So we select environments that maximize what we're good at, so that it's very impossible to pull them apart, and I prefer a more holistic kind of model. So what about drugs and hormones? I haven't said much about drugs and hormones. You know, we have new ethical dilemmas. There is a lot of research on hormones in effects on cognition. We know that when transsexuals are undergoing sex change surgery, prior to that, they usually have hormones that are the predominant. We all have all kinds of hormones. So it has to do with the relative contribution. Changing those relative contributions do have an effect on cognition. There are some studies, one that had, I have no idea how they got away with this, I don't know, but they had double-blind procedures where women were injected with androgen, and they had placebo controls and crossovers, and and in fact showed better skills in visual spatial tasks with the extra male hormone. Creates all kinds of new ethical dilemmas. We are certainly not there yet, and I'm certainly not advocating that this is in fact a truth, that hormone has a direct improved performance on visual spatial skills. But suppose it did, and suppose you're doing tricky brain surgery. Suppose you're landing an airplane at night with with highly, some instance where it's critically important to have enhanced visual spatial skills. It's not impossible that these are the kinds of ethical dilemmas that we really will be struggling with. If it were safe, it were effective. So there's an elephant in the room, something that's politely ignored in some of these data. I say that differences are not deficiencies, but that's certainly not true what people hear, and it's not true in the language people use. Baron Cohen, who is a psychologist, says that male brains are better for systematizing, and they are naturally better in math and science. Female brains are better for empathizing, so they're better for caring professions. Needless to say, we depart on company on these kinds of interpretations. I think they're flat out wrong, and I have said so in many places. But clearly, this is the kind of thing we're hearing from prize-winning psychologists. But there's another elephant or gorilla in the room. Do men have? Do men really have brains that are evolved better for math and science? And we're losing part of the data, something to be considered. Again, I say that our data clearly don't support this, but this is what a lot of what we've read and a lot of people are willing to argue. There's a second elephant in the room, and no one seems to see both of them, and that's the fact that are females really smarter than males? You may have learned or read that females are achieving at higher rates. They're winning a lot of the prizes. They have been the majority in college enrollment since the late 70s, early 80s. They're getting many more prizes and awards. What does this mean? The case of the missing man, the idea that there are fewer men than women in college overall. The numbers seem to have leveled off and maybe be dipping some, but there are a majority of college enrollments are female across, the university-wide. Having said that, though, the disparities at the top universities are very close, but on average, there certainly are more women there. Should we have an SAT test for spatial abilities? It's been suggested. Many years ago, actually, I did some consulting for 8 years with ETS on their graduate record exam, and the highest places that had a high levels of selection criteria wanted a spatial test. They've argued that it would help identify people who would do best in some highly spatial fields. I can guarantee you that if we have such a test, we will find that women score less high, since we already have those data, and this will shut more women out of STEM fields. And we have no direct data that actually say that having those higher skills translates into better scientists. To be a scientist today, one needs a whole variety of skills: writing skills, reading skills, communication skills, math skills, visual spatial skills. I know of no direct data that in fact say that having particularly high on visual spatial is important for success. But these are things that have been suggested and to consider. The test grade disparity, I already told you, on average, males score higher on most of these standardized tests, and females get better grades in school. So someone will say to me, well, there's evidence that schools are biased against boys. Someone else will say, here's evidence that standardized tests are biased against girls. And you have these differences. Are they a difference of bias, or in fact, are they measuring something different? Are we part of the problem by just talking about it? Stereotype threat has to do with our social groups that we identify with and the way we signal threat. And by telling you about these differences, are they somehow making them bigger? Well, the no part says that stereotypes and beliefs flourish in the absence of data, that we're not creating the differences by talking about it. We can't remediate anything if we don't talk about it. We can't pretend, we can only pretend it doesn't exist. We only have ignorance. But the data are misused. My own data have been misused. And it's a constant fight against the misuse of data and how we make interpretations from it. And in conclusion, there's no single or simple answer to the question about sex differences in cognitive abilities. It is complicated. Anytime someone says to you, it's all in hormones, it's all in mother's attitudes, a bell should go off in your head and say it's not that simple or that single. There was a group put together by the Association of Psychological Science to study it. There were a group of experts that met over 2 years. I was in that group, and our conclusion was early experience, biological factors, educational policy, cultural context affect the number of women and men who pursue advanced study in science and math, and their effects add and interact in complex ways. Now, I know what you're thinking. I know what you're thinking when you read something like that. You're thinking, they don't know the answer. That's the answer. And how many experts did it take to meet for how long to come up with the conclusion that it's complicated? Well, in fact, that is the answer. And people don't like that answer. They want the simple answer. They want the short answer. But in fact, that is the answer. And it took us a long time, actually, would be the answer to that other question. Well, let me conclude with the wisdom of, any of you know him? Nesruddin Hoja? Anyone here know this good-looking young man? Okay, let me tell you about him. He has a counterpart throughout Eastern Europe. Some of you may have heard these stories. I was teaching a number of years ago at a university in Istanbul, and I was talking about how sometimes this theory seems right, that one seems right, and how we balance it, and trying to put this out to the students. And someone said, I realize that you're culturally deprived coming from the US, and let me tell you about Nesruddin Hoja. And he was a very wise man. There are many such stories about him. In one of the stories, he's a judge. And he's sitting at home one day, and a neighbor knocks on the door and says, Nesruddin, can I come in? He says, sure. He said, well, let me tell you about my next door neighbor. He's terrible. He did this, he did that. He's a terrible person. So he listens, and he says, my good man, you were right. And the neighbor leaves. A few minutes later, the other neighbor comes, knocks on the door, and says, can I tell you about my neighbor, the one who just left? He's terrible. He's a horrible person. He does this, he does that. Nesruddin says, my good man, you were right. And he leaves. Then his wife comes out from the other room, and she says, what happened? I was listening. You told this one he's right, you told that one he's right, they can't both be right. And he looks at her and he says, my good woman, you are right. And so I think that what we have here is part of the answer. Each of these many pieces, and this is a very large puzzle, has something right about it. And what we need to do is draw from each of the levels and try to understand how this complex issue of how we are similar and different in our cognitive abilities. Thank you, and I think we have time for questions.